violence and dispossession and displacement. So anyway, I'm hoping some more people will be coming out there and will join us in due course. But I want to welcome you to today's session. I'm very excited and delighted to be hosting an anthropologist, a fellow anthropologist, Professor Mona Bhan. Before I introduce you to Mona and say a few more words about Mona's work and her scholarship and her activism, I want to alert those of you who may not know about the two series Wildcard is running, among others. And we have created these beautiful little flyers to save nature and planet and everything. So please collect them. And we're fortunate that we actually have, I'm going to keep both of them and pass them up. One is being, and Mona's talk is actually, we're doing double dipping. Mona is presenting in both the series as part of the South Asia lecture series on democracy and democratization, which is South Asia lecture series. And we had last month, we had Professor Rukmini Barua, who presented her work as part of the series. And we'll have another one, next session will be in January by one of our senior PhD students, Chris Balcom, speaking in January. I don't remember the date. So that's up 15th. And then a film will be as part of the series by filmmaker Ravi Bachani is happening in February. So if you are interested, please sign up for the listserv if you're not a member of the Wildcard South Asia Research Cluster or for the listserv. And in addition to that, we've been running this Climate Dystopias in Asia series, and I'm glad that Mona can sort of her talk actually bridges or intersects with both the topics we're covering today. So I welcome you all to these double talks in some sense, and please share this and please come with your friends and colleagues and come for future ones. But thank you here for being here a beautiful sunny day. Professor Mona Bhan is a professor of anthropology and the Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies at Syracuse University, which also happens to be my alma mater, so I'm quite familiar. I don't know where her office is, but I think I might know. Mona is a political and environmental anthropologist whose work on Indian-occupied Kashmir has explored the role of economic and infrastructural development in counterinsurgency operations and people's resistance movements to protracted wars and settler occupation. Her areas of specialization include wars, militarism and counterinsurgency, indigeneity and settler colonialism, race, gender and religion, ecocide and climate change, and military occupation and infrastructure policies. Mona is a prolific writer. She's published extensively. Just to name a few, her book, The Counterinsurgency, Development and the Politics of Identity, from Warfare to Welfare, is one of her books, and she has another co-authored book with Andrew Bauer called Climate Without Nature, A Critical Anthropology of the Anthropocene. Importantly, Mona has been one of the few voices who's been speaking about Kashmir and Indian-occupied Kashmir in and what has been going on in India for the last almost 75 years. And with her colleagues, she started the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective that she has co-founded in 2013. She has co-edited Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, the Rutledge Handbook of Critical Kashmir Studies, and the Palgrave Handbook of New Directions in Kashmir Studies. She's also co-edited, in addition to her work, special issues of the Journal of Legal Tourism and the Unofficial Law and Critique of in Critique of Anthropology. Since 2022, as part of a Lender Fellowship for Social Justice, Mona has now begun working with a team of undergraduate students and graduate students in Syracuse to examine how AI is reconfiguring the city, with the special attention on the ways in which AI has shaped surveillance and policing technologies, discourses of securitization, STEM education in city schools, and claims and counterclaims to citizenship. So yes, a very new, interesting project, and I can't wait to hear more about it, but also the kind of the intersections between what is happening in different parts of India also comes home in some other ways. So without further ado, I would request Mona to give a talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shubhra, for a very generous introduction and also for having me here. Thanks also to Alicia and Shreyashi for all the back-end work. I know it's always a lot, and you guys were so wonderfully patient with me. So I do appreciate that. Still forgot to get my glasses. I should. I do need my reading glasses. It's a new thing, so I forget. And thank you also for taking me for this wonderful talk. It actually feels, I mean, as Snowman and I were just talking, I feel deeply humbled, but also this, sense of despair that we all are feeling right now. It clearly, to me, just listening to our speaker talk about hope in context of extreme despair was just deeply humbling and very empowering. So on that note, this paper that I'm presenting today is part of a larger book project that I've been working on for a while now, and I'm hoping to really just be done with it as soon as I can. So thanks for indulging me. There's parts of this talk that I've actually not presented. There are other parts I have presented before, so it's a mixed bag. But what I'm really looking for is extensive feedback and comments and questions. I welcome all of those. So dams have been at the center of Indian life for several decades and a part of the faith since eons. When the celestial Ganga came crashing onto Earth, its ferocity would have broken the planet into smithereens had it not been Lord Shiva who dammed its flow in his locks and saved the planet. This was Gajendra Singh Shekhawat, a BJP affiliated union minister of the newly constituted Jal Shakti Department, Water Resources Development Department, which was constituted in 2019. His opinions reflect the BJP government's claims to harness the power of dams to save the planet. Since the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, framed them as temples of modern India, dams in India have long served as embodiments of the Hindu faith and cosmology. In Shekhawat's statement, for instance, Lord Shiva's active intervention to dam the Ganga's ferocious flows in his locks saved the planet from being broken into smithereens. Shiva's locks became the dam that tamed the mighty Ganga. In this new Indian consciousness, dams are now framed as, quote, the silent warriors who labor to keep the country safe, end quote, or as, quote, silent sentinels that ensure our access to the lifeblood of our planet, end quote. In addition to being representative of human ingenuity, perseverance, and the spirit of cooperation, the minister anoints dams as civilizational structures that are mentioned in the Vedas and the Arthashastras and celebrated as tools to, quote, combat water scarcity. Consider another statement. It's a 2017 statement by a top-ranking BJP official in India's power ministry in support of fast-tracking hydroelectric dams in Kashmir to punish Pakistan for its alleged terrorism against India. And this is what he says. I say the way you look at these projects, it's not purely a hydro project. Broaden it to a strategic water management, border management problem, and then you put in the money. I begin my talk with these two quotes to ask, what might it mean to frame dams as entities that are not pure hydro objects? How might, harkening back to Hindu mythology, to frame dams, seen often as the epitome of high modernist infrastructure, inaugurate a new understanding of how and why hydropower fuels Hindu nationalist imaginaries in contemporary India? In what ways do dams in Kashmir make them integral tools tools of combat and counterinsurgency and border management in geopolitical rivalries. My larger book project examines these questions to show how dams are increasingly venerated for heralding India's renewable energy futures and for embodying the power and sacredness of ancient Hindu gods. Dams thus become ideal sentinels, upholding the timelessness and continuity of the Indian Hindu nation against threats, both natural and geopolitical. But even before the Hindu right under Narendra Modi consecrated them as India's civilizational structures, building on Nehru's earlier claims, as we just heard, dams were considered India's sentinels in Kashmir and a key component of India's counterinsurgency war in the region. Dams were meant to serve a pedagogical function by taming Kashmir's recalcitrant Muslim population through jobs and employment, and detract them from Pakistan-sponsored armed militancy. As extensions of a security military apparatus, dams imposed forced population resettlements, impeded movement, and reproduced networks of policing and containment, particularly in areas along the line of control, in places such as Gurez and Bandipora, parts of which are in that demarcated blue line, and this is part of what we consider to be North Kashmir. Based on 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork between 2012 and 2018 along the line of control, which is the de facto border between India and Pakistan, in places such as Gurez and Bandipora, I focus on the 330 megawatt Kashinganga Dam to examine the ways in which dams, as part of India's counterinsurgency infrastructure, refigured Kashmir's social and political worlds. Following Leopold Lambert, I disrupt the innocence of infrastructure to show how dams were rooted in India's possessive logics and how they played a part in reinscribing Indian claims on Kashmir's contested landscapes and waterscapes. Gurez is a tehsil which is situated on the line of control, and it has a population. This is just the construction of the dam. This is a population of around 40,000 people and a very heavy military presence that locals argue almost equals the local population of Sunni Muslims who consider themselves to be Dards or Shins, which is an ethno-linguistic Shina-speaking minority. Ensconced within narrow valley and deep gorges, land in Gurez is already scarce, with the military occupying a total of 400 acres, all of it fenced and inaccessible to local populations. Bandipora, which is around 80 kilometers from Gurez, is the bustling city center, district headquarters, with a majority population of Kashmiri-speaking Sunni Muslims, but also other communities and other ethno-linguistic minorities as well. But this is also where the NHPC, or the National Hydroelectric Power Corporation, which is India's premier corporation that is responsible for building most hydroelectric dams across India and in Kashmir, is permanently stationed here. And they're the ones who built the Kashinganga Dam. So Bandipora is this space or this region where the NHPC built a powerhouse for the dam after rerouting water from the Kashinganga River in Gurez through tunnels, a 23.5 kilometer long tunnel into Bandipora. So the two places are linked through this tunnel now, which basically siphons off water from Gurez into Bandipora. In the Indian political narrative, the Hinduization of dams does not operate in isolation, but is intertwined with its politics to territorialize Kashmir. In March 2019, India declared hydropower a renewable energy resource, claiming that doing so would encourage the commissioning of new large hydroelectric projects in the Himalayas, particularly in Jammu and Kashmir and the northeast Indian states. And they also argued that it would stabilize the national grid and pave the way for India to become competitive for international green financing, making all hydropower, and not just projects up to 25 megawatt, renewable, and therefore part of the clean energy segment, was designed to boost the industry's potential and improve its fiscal health, which experts claimed was in a deep state of decline had been in a steep and deep state of decline for a long time. Hydropower energy sector that had almost faded, they claimed, from the discourse of India's energy security was therefore revived once again in 2019, March 2019. But only months after this decision, the Indian government revoked Kashmir's autonomous constitutional status, making a militarily occupied region even more vulnerable to massive hydropower investments and to India's extractive logics. These provisions had maintained, for those of you who don't know, these provisions had maintained Kashmir's semi-autonomous status in India and its United Nations mandated right to self-determination through a free and impartial plebiscite. A key site of hydropower generation for India, but also of India's brutal counterinsurgency war against Kashmiri Muslims since the 1990s that consumed around 100,000 Kashmiri lives and meted upon communities the horrors of custodial killings, rapes, sexual violence, and torture. The discourse of renewability served to erase the political work of India's settler colonial or settler extractivism. In recent years, greenwashing has become a key element of settler colonial extractive politics as more and more land is now appropriated and communities dispossessed under the pretext of renewability. Israel, for instance, as Hugh et al. Show, uses environmental infrastructures, especially in the areas of waste management, renewable energy, and agricultural technologies or agri-tech, as mechanisms for land appropriation and dispossession in Palestine. While ecological harm is braided into the logics of settler colonial violence, the discourse and infrastructures of renewability offer, they argue, new opportunities for settler colonial state making and consolidation of state power in contested territories. End quote. Kashmir's insurgent terrain, thus once known to produce armed anti-India fighters, was now reimagined to contain plentiful water resources that could produce clean, renewable energy, untrammeled by constitutional provisions that had impeded Kashmir and its hydrological futures. India's investments in hydroelectric dams had led to a corresponding increase. So this sort of discourse around hydropower and its efficiency and so on and so forth. While this was happening, there was also a corresponding increase of power outages for Kashmiris, the worst in the last 2 decades. Members of the political opposition deemed the prolonged power cuts, which often lasted 12 to 16 hours at the peak of winter, to be a form of, quote, collective punishment. The prolonged water cuts in March 2024, for example, at the onset of the month of Ramadan, were viewed in particular as the administration's deliberate attempt to deprive Kashmiris of electricity by refusing to purchase sufficient powers for the winters. Such forms of collective punishment were, of course, not new. Even in 2017 and before, electricity was, quote, perhaps the second most talked about issue in Jammu and Kashmir. And this is in the context of the conflict. More recently, the Kashmir Power Development Corporation, or KPDCL, which is what I'm going to call it from here on, has started large-scale inspection drives to tackle the phenomenon of power theft in Kashmir. This provocative initiative, they claim, was aimed at, quote, targeting individuals involved in illegal hooking activities, a practice that significantly compromised the integrity of the power distribution network, end quote. In a series of videos, they're on Twitter, very heavy presence on Twitter. So in a series of videos they're released on Twitter, Kashmiris are publicly named and shamed for pilfering electricity and blamed for their utter disregard for its equitable distribution. For instance, in one of the many videos circulating on KPDCL's Twitter page, the caption mockingly headlined, Deep State, yeah, that's the one, shows employees of KPDCL using shovels to dig pilfered devices in an underground operation to explain the paucity of electricity in Kashmir. Unlike his campaign assurance or 24/7 power, the BJP's priorities in Kashmir are very different. It is to punish Kashmiri pilferers by naming and shaming them and inflicting them to public humiliation for stealing power over which the government claims Kashmiris have no legal rights. Over the years in India, electricity has become, Leo Coleman explains, a material site for the moralization of politics, a public utility that is deeply entrenched with and often reflective of, he claims, the moral truth of political life. In Kashmir, where India's praxis and politics are not post-colonial but deeply colonial, the discourse of morality serves other purposes. Rather than holding state representatives responsible for the missing electricity or for prolonged power cuts, discourses of public morality serve to intensify the extent and reach of the surveillance state. In order to fully comprehend what lies behind carefully scripted tales of public immorality, power shortages, and electricity theft in Kashmir, it is necessary to understand the political, legal, and historical context that shapes the use and distribution of Kashmir's river resources, which are a key source of power and production of electricity for the region, most of which, of course, is siphoned off to India. Kashmiris only get 12% of it, and that too after paying a humongous amount of money to purchase that electricity. So my next section is subtitled "How a River Becomes a Border: The Indus Water Treaty as a Border Infrastructure." Amidst India and Pakistan's political stalemate over Kashmir in the 1940s and 50s, the World Bank brokered the Indus Water Treaty in the 1960s, which split the control over the rivers of the Indus Water Basin between India and Pakistan. There's 6 rivers in all. The western 3 rivers flow through Kashmir, and those are the Indus, the Jhelum, and the Chenab. So Pakistan has consumptive rights over those 3 rivers, and India has consumptive rights over the eastern rivers, the Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. While the Indus Water Treaty is often hailed for surviving 4 wars between India and Pakistan, the treaty has all along been silent on Kashmir's contested sovereignties. And this silence has been strategic, treating them as distinctly separate political and economic issues, as some have claimed. The British hoped that resolving water sharing issues between India and Pakistan would serve as, quote, an inducement for Pakistanis to relax their claims on Kashmir. So the British viewed the political settlement over water of critical importance in the absence of any light, they claimed, any light in regards to the Kashmir dispute. This is a quote from an archive. Indeed, settling Indian and Pakistani claims over Kashmir's rivers offered a way to defer the Kashmir issue. The Indus Water Treaty underwrote the future of the Indus River Basin while reducing it into a political and a security resource. By partitioning rivers, the IWT transformed rivers into borders, even as the territorial division between Indian and Pakistani administered territories, called the ceasefire line at the time, which is now the line of control, remained politically ambiguous. So an integrated river basin was disintegrated and rivers were partitioned to create international borders, making rivers an integral part of India and Pakistan's border infrastructure. Rivers thus make up for the ambiguity that Kashmir's land embodied. That nature can become infrastructural is now a well-established fact. Nature's infrastructural capacity lies in how it enables, it mediates, facilitates, restricts, and regulates the flow or transfer of people or commodities, or how it is reconfigured to provide services for economic development, or the ways in which it can be transformed into a killing machine to decimate unwanted populations, as Jason de Leon's work has shown so powerfully. In Leon's ethnography, we see multiple instances of how U.S. border enforcement relies on rugged and desolate desert terrain to render invisible its work of impeding the flow of people from the south. In doing so, nature becomes a weapon, a securitized proxy for border enforcement agents. The IWT too served as a tool to territorialize the rivers in this basin and convert them into, quote, political partitions. At the same time, this treaty undermined the Kashmiri right of self-determination by trapping water in a sovereignty war between India and Pakistan. In doing so, it transformed Kashmiri rivers into geopolitical waters, inaugurating securitized mechanisms such as large-scale damming projects as material and ideological fortifications to sustain India's extractive hydropolitics and retain its coercive control over Kashmiri territory. Consider this cartoon by Farooq Ahmed Bhatt, a local artist, who brilliantly captures how India and Pakistan continue to control waters of the Indus Basin through bilateral agreements which ignore Kashmiri rights over these rivers. In a seemingly conciliatory gesture, the cartoon shows Modi and I think it's Imran Khan filling their respective jars with cups of water from a river, with Modi proclaiming that one cup of water is India's while the other one belongs to Pakistan. In another more politically explicit cartoon, cartoonist Mir Sohail shows the dried and desiccated skeleton of a Kashmiri pegged to a two-way straw, represented here as the Indus Water Treaty, which is used both by India and Pakistan to suck Kashmiri rivers dry. While such public discourses around the IWT became more common after the 2010s, roughly around then, Kashmiris did not foreground the Indus Water Treaty's role in curtailing Kashmiri economic sovereignty in the immediate years after Kashmir's accession to India, thereby making minimal connections, if any, between political and economic independence. The question became key to public political discourses in Kashmir in subsequent years, with people attributing Kashmir's economic backwardness to the constraining terms of the Indus Water Treaty. As India's dam building on Kashmir's contested rivers intensified, particularly after the 1990s, Kashmiris started to demand their rivers back, claiming that India's design was to cripple Kashmiris economically and deny them their political rights by framing them as resource poor and solely dependent on Indian largesse. Of course, the claim was that because India relies so much on Kashmir's power to supply, to run its own industries, this claim that Kashmiris have a begging bowl always ready seems, of course, false. People were particularly riled up after it became known that the important document that could determine financial implications and responsibilities for various stakeholders was in fact missing. Even a task force was constituted in 2012 to launch, quote, a massive manhunt to find the traces of the vital Memorandum of Understanding document, which was signed between the NHPC and the state, but no one could find this prized document. The missing agreements, unmet promises, and the siphoning of Kashmir's water resources, along with the brutal silencing of dissent, meant that many in civil society did not see the NHPC's presence in Kashmir outside the context of Kashmir's long-drawn militarized occupation. For many Kashmiris, the NHPC's investments in hydropower were an indubitable expression of India's illegitimate rule in the region, with the NHPC acting as the corporate arm of India's occupation. My other section is entitled Dams, Other Burdens. The postponing of the Kashmir issue that made the IWT possible and enabled India and Pakistan to maintain a semblance of peace did little to quell the silent yet seething outrage against India's coercive control over Kashmir, which had military, political, and economic dimensions. In 1989, Kashmiri Muslims began an armed struggle to free Kashmir from Indian rule. In addition to the violent decades of counterinsurgency, discourses of economic development too assumed center stage, particularly after the Indian Army mainstreamed population-centric modes of counterinsurgency operations, according to which good governance, building state legitimacy, and winning people's hearts and minds were considered key to countering and managing dissent. At this time, dams were seen as India's priority projects, and the Indian state was invested heavily in building them, despite Kashmir's quote-unquote raging militancy. By the 2000s, thus, dams animated India's other sovereignty experiments in Kashmir in the name of counterinsurgency and political stabilization. Dams were key components of the Prime Minister's reconstruction plan in 2004, for instance. during the tenure of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, a plan that was implemented to respond to decades of conflict and economic underdevelopment in Kashmir, which many Indian policy analysts consider to be the root cause of Kashmiri insurgency. Along with fencing the line of control and fortifying it with sensors and 2 rows of barbed wires to stop cross-border infiltrations, the plan foregrounded economic development as an important stabilizing force in the region. Indeed, investments in industries such as timber, fruit processing, and the power sector were critical for, quote, neutering the allure of jihadi-inspired radicalization, end quote. Indeed, according to my interlocutor, Mr. Siraj, Indian dams assumed military-like functions in India's counterinsurgency war. As critical military installations in places such as Gurez and Bandipora that were located close to the contested line of control, the Kishinganga Dam rerouted riverine waters, but also money and jobs via networks of political, economic, and religious patronage that emerged within the context of India's war in Kashmir. In this paper, I'm not talking about religious patronage. That's an important part of this chapter that I've left out for in the interest of time. It's also a part that I'm struggling with myself, ethnographically and ethically too, but I'm happy to answer questions. If infrastructures are meant to, quote, enable exchange over space, as Larkin argues, dams become infrastructural in other ways, ensuring not just the redirection of water, but the sustained, albeit indeterminate flow of what I call counter-terror money, or what is locally called source funds. In particular, in the larger book project, I examined the ways in which differently situated people saw the Kishinganga Dam intervening in everyday social relations and in the reorganization of political forces to become a part of India's weapons systems against a popular insurgency. And here I'm drawing from Dennis Yonaju's excellent book on policing and counterinsurgency in Turkey. Unlike the illicit black money or terror money that the government claimed was funneled through Pakistan and funded anti-India protests in Kashmir, the dam's money materialized as contractual and unskilled jobs and political power and patronage was designed to tame Kashmiri resistance by consolidating pro-India individuals and institutions, particularly in Bandipora, with a long history of insurgent mobilizations and counterinsurgency violence. Here I offer a few glimpses into this anti-terror assemblage of money and patronage that solidified India's counterinsurgency networks in Kashmir, particularly in the 1990s. By the time the construction of the Kishinganga Dam began, India had created pro-government militia units, or Ikhwans, to counter Kashmiri rebels and rout out armed militancy from Kashmir. Ikhwanis were formerly surrendered or captured militants who were organized and armed by the Indian Army and other security forces and operated under their command and protection. Constituted in 1993, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the militia, basically did the Indian military's dirty job in the valley, providing them a much-needed breakthrough in a war that India seemed to be losing, according to Indian experts. Known for inflicting worse forms of extrajudicial violence on Kashmiris, which included sexual violence, rape, torture, killings, and disappearances, the Ikhwanis became part of the informalization of everyday state terror and played a large part in what Haley Tuchinski claims is the ways in which they reproduce regimes of impunity within the context of Kashmir's occupation. A law unto itself is how Bashir Manzar, a Kashmiri journalist, describes the terror outfit. Bandipora was a hotbed of Ikhwan recruitments, and several of its founding and top-ranking recruits were from villages in and around Bandipora. Many of these rehabilitated militants for the 1996 elections in Kashmir in order to legitimize Indian democracy and mainstream themselves as part of the political elite within the context of the Indian state's ongoing assault on Kashmiri rights. One of the key insurgents was Osman Majid, a former militant turned Ikhwani, who at the time of my fieldwork in Bandipora was a Congress party affiliated MLA. Usman was key to resurrecting the facade of Indian democracy in Kashmir at a critical time in the mid 1990s when India was trying hard to curb Kashmiri terrorism. While his brother was killed by Kashmiri rebels in 2002, Majid continued to inflict his reign of terror in connivance with special counterinsurgency forces of the Indian state, such as the Rashtriya Rifles and the Special Task Force, a specialist elite and frontline counterinsurgency wing of the police in Kashmir. As India launched its population-centric counterinsurgency warfare in the region, the Kishimganga Dam rehabilitated former Kashmiri counterinsurgents, such as Usman Majid and many others, and cemented pro-India political, religious, and corporate networks. For many of my interlocutors, the NHPC, the military, and the Ikhwan had acted in collusion to destroy Bandipora's social, political, and ecological fabric. Salman, an activist in the Jamaat Islamic Party in Kashmir, and was an important member of the Kashmiri Tehreek, the Kashmiri Movement for Self-Determination, for example, recounted how, quote, in the month of September 1995 alone, the Ikhwanis killed an estimated 268 people with Jamaat al-Islami leanings. The Ikhwan proudly proclaimed that they had successfully broken the Jamaat's back by killing 500 intellectuals, which included doctors, engineers, lawyers, professors, and journalists. These are such horrid times. These were such horrid times of torture and killings. आज भी लोगों को डर लगता है सोच के. They would cut up bodies into pieces to instill fear among people. End quote. Based on an RTI application, Salman and his allies filed. This was way back in 2012. 25 to 30 lakh trees, for example, were felled and 75 crore worth property was looted by the Ikhwanis. Salman's claims were corroborated by Kuk Pare. Kuk Pare was a prominent Ikhwani himself, one of the leaders of the Ikhwani movement, and Usman Majid was second in command to Kuk Pare. So this is Kuk Pare's interview in a magazine, Indian magazine called India Today from 1993, when the reporter asked him that there was a charge against him that he was felling trees to raise funds. This is how he responded, quote, I don't tell lies. Yes, I do cut trees. How else am I going to get the money to support my cadres? It costs rupees 4,000 to 5,000 per month to maintain each man, and I have 6,000 of them. We are not getting money from Pakistan. If I'm cutting trees, so what? For every tree that I cut, you can plant another one. Salman's narratives rarely differentiated the violence of the Ikhwan and the military from that of the NHPC. For instance, as he recalled Ikhwan's violent ecocide in the early 1990s that destroyed Bandipora's dense forest cover, he immediately switched to talking about the ecological catastrophes that the NHPC's presence had inflicted on Bandipora's rivers and its water bodies. Quote, NHPC ek zehreela naag hai. It's a poisonous snake. The chemicals they use for digging tunnels has turned our green and luscious landscapes into dust. Out of 10 trees, 4 have dried up. This is like a hydrogen bomb. The water is a weapon. End quote. When the project started in 2003, Usman Majid had been the MLA of Bandipora for over a year. After the killings of most of his fellow Ikhwanis, which included Kuk Pare, Majid was the last flag bearer of the Awami League Party, considered to be the political wing of Ikhwan al-Muslimin. The synergy between the military and Majid thrived on people's vulnerabilities to state terror, according to Salman. Indeed, the Indian Army's support for Majid's campaign is a khula raz, an open secret. The army would arrest people, then distraught families would approach Majid, who was known to have rusuk, cordial relations with the army. He promised to help free their kin in exchange for their vote. Army, in Kashmiri it says, Army Ratan Ikhwan Travan. Army would catch them, the Ikhwan would leave them or help them get released. This is one of the ways Majid built his vote base in Bandipora. Ikhwanis also went to several villages, forcing them to sell land to the NHPC. So Majid made people, I was told repeatedly, ready for the dam. While violent tactics fueled his Ikhwani mission in Kashmir, Majid relied on the language of economic development, deluding the unemployed youth in Bandipora with the promise of a better life. I was told that sometimes he or his agents would distribute money to the young who were told that they had jobs with the NHPC or the HCC, which was a subcontracting company responsible for building Kashmir. But apart from this, NHPC was responsible for Bandipura's moral corruption. NHPC was the frustrated face of the Indian Army, Salman confided in me. Many minor girls were either wooed or forcibly taken. Sometimes the men were abducted or disappeared, and women who begged for their release were asked for sexual favors. The social management of Bandipura, through circuits of money, patronage, and politics, was key to making people ready for the dam and fragmenting communities to sustain India's counterinsurgency war. While dams until then were mostly viewed as an integral part of the counterinsurgency infrastructure in Kashmir, they are increasingly now being reconfigured as renewable sources of energy. A move that coincided, as I said earlier, with the abrogation of India's constitutional provisions that guaranteed Kashmir's political autonomy in the Indian Union. While hitherto framed as a counterinsurgent force, hydropower's capacities for grid integration, you can ask me later what those terms mean, but hydropower is supposed to help integrate the grid better and for balancing national infirmities. These are just quotes from documents on hydropower files. They are now considered hydropower's key assets in context of climate catastrophes. Hydropower, we are repeatedly told, compensates, quote, for the intermittent nature of solar and wind, providing stability to the electric grid. Hydropower's characteristics of, quote, quick start, stop, spinning reserve, voltage, and frequency regulation are most suited for, quote, a dynamic grid. Such celebratory public and political discourses around dams are not unique to India. After witnessing a slide in the 1990s, dam construction, Firmino et al. Argue, has, quote, entered a new period of growth as hydropower is increasingly packaged as clean energy. This resurgence, however, Barnaby Dye cautions us, must not be viewed as a mere reproduction of the high modernist ideology that framed the construction of dams in the 20th century. Such an important evolution of high modernist ideas must be placed within specific ideological context to reveal the situated ways in which discourses of clean energy interface with, quote, illiberal forms of state making in the 21st century. In its reconfiguration, thus, hydropower offered yet another vision of security and stability to India, a different kind of a vision of stability, as it became India's, quote, forever asset. As hydropower's foreverness makes water a cyclical resource, it conjures imaginaries of the Indian nation itself as an eternal, dynamic, and timeless entity, an argument I turn to in my next and final section. Hydropower allows India to greenwash its obsessive control over Kashmir while also enabling an amnesiac view of Kashmiri history and political struggle, a key element of which is how India has for decades used hydropower's clean energy to run its dirty wars in Kashmir. So renewability in the Indian and the Hindu nation is the last section of the paper. So what were the political and material logics that co-produced hydropower in as India's forever asset and Kashmir as Hindu India's eternal and timeless part within the context of India's illegal sovereignty over Kashmir and its unfolding and impending climate emergency? Several scholars have shown how the human rights, environmental politics is deeply enmeshed with aggressive nationalism. I'm quoting Mukul Sharma's work, also an article I co-wrote with Radhika Govindarajan recently. We kind of tried to explain this points a little better. With the strategic use of environmental and climate rhetoric and the invocation of renewable energy as India's key priority, the Hindu supremacist government frames India as an ancient Hindu ecological civilization, while Modi, of course, is presented as a savior in times of climate catastrophes. The association of wind, sun, and water with Hindu gods the association of wind, sun, and water with Hindu gods and goddesses, which frame these elements as primordially Hindu, implies that the organic power of these elements does not just produce electricity. It powers the Hindu nation and gives it a foreverness, derived from the eternal and sacred power of earth and sky beings. I mean, that's why we did this Yojana, the solar Yojana, right after Ayodhya. Ironically, until recently, Hindu ethics and philosophy were deployed in the service of anti-dam activism struggles in India, as we might know. Opposition to the Tehri Dam, for instance, relied on Hindu motives and symbolism, which reinforced and promoted, according to Maudsley, the chauvinist idea of Hindu nationalism. Drew shows how in the initial years of the protest against the building of hydroelectric dams in the river Ganga, mountain communities who were Hindu worried about the disruption of the Ganga's passage through the region. Ganga's freely flowing waters they considered to be the guardians of Hindu culture, Sanskriti and tradition, etc. They claimed this Ganga had to be rescued from this dam and from the violence of these mega dams, and we had to somehow make sure that the flow of Ganga remained uninterrupted. Dams were therefore resisted by many Hindu ideologues in India who worried about interrupted or disrupted flows as a desecration of India's sacred geography. How then have dams or hydropower, particularly on the Indus, become key to salvaging the Indian Hindu nation? I talked previously about how environments are enrolled as borders. Here I ask how the effects and outcomes of this enrollment might vary if borders are too fluid to cooperate with the state's territorial aspiration. Sundberg's work is illuminating in this regard. She shows how the Sonora Desert in southern Arizona, quote, inflects, disrupts, and obstructs the daily practice of boundary enforcement, or how felines reconfigure the everyday encounters and negotiations that constitute border enforcement. But as Thomas reminds us, rivers are troublesome borders. As inherently itinerant entities, rivers routinely defy cartographic depictions of borders as static, territorially bounded formations. Since their itinerant flows are hard to regulate, they pose a serious challenge to state authorities who find it difficult to use them as fixed markers of sovereignty. The situation is considerably different when the flows are not just itinerant, but also recalcitrant, even seditious. Most of the Indus River, at least 80% of it, is in Pakistan. For many right-wing critics and commentators in India, the Indus Water Treaty and this was Nehru's grave mistake. They're pinning it on him. He was a weak man, they claim, and less than an ideal negotiator, because of which India only now has 20% of the Indus waters, while Pakistan has 80%. So this poses to many in India an existential crisis that is deeply linked with their religious and civilizational identity as Indians. This is because the Indus is considered by many to be the cradle of the Hindu civilization and a sacred repository of Hindu history, which represents the power and permanence of 5,000-year-old Hindu history. Many even consider the word Hindu to have derived from Sindhu, which is Indus, considered a male warrior god. Unlike other rivers, Indus is deified as a male god. But India's generosity, they claim, is now over, and India will ensure that the IWT's unfair terms no longer pose an impediment to the untrammeled use of its civilizational waters. Having fully exhausted its reserves of benevolence toward Pakistan, India would see to it, they claim, that water and terror can no longer flow together. And we've seen or heard Modi say this a few times already. I've often heard from engineers how riverine flows, unless tapped for energy, were a complete waste. But the free-flowing rivers pose existential threats that were seemingly far more pernicious than their ability to serve as sources of energy, particularly when they flowed into enemy territory. So unless they were redirected, the seditious flows could help proliferate life of the wrong kind. In recent years, such rhetoric has received renewed impetus as waters of the Indus Basin have become part of Modi's new instrument of foreign policy vis-à-vis Pakistan and India's diplomatic weapon to retaliate against a recalcitrant neighbor. For example, in the aftermath of the Uri attack allegedly by Pakistan on the military camp in which many Indian soldiers died, Modi announced that he was going to bring the Indus water back. The waters of the Satluj, Indus, and Ravi flowing through Pakistan, he said, had to return to India so so that its farmers in Punjab and in Jammu and Kashmir could benefit. To claim waters of the Indus Basin River, to use each drop of water that belongs to Indians, as Modi announced in one of his 2016 speeches, was meant to claim India's rivers as sacred repositories of Hindu history. In a context where the Indus is deified as a water god, building dams on the Indus, therefore, is viewed by many Indians as a masterstroke to keep Pakistan in check. And therefore, unlike Ganga, whose waters need to flow, Indus's waters need to be rerouted, because that's the only way that Indus can fuel or refuel the Indian national imaginary. So, commenting on the inauguration of the Kashmir Dam, an Indian analyst remarks, quote, "In my opinion, Modi's masterstroke, which has been kept muted perhaps intentionally, is the tapping of the Indus River and its tributaries in Jammu and Kashmir for our own use, culminating with the inauguration of the Kashmir Dam. Pakistan will not listen to reason. The ability to disrupt their agriculture and water supplies at will is a Brahmastra that should be kept in the arsenal." That should be kept in the arsenal, and the enemy should know that it can be used at significant times. Insofar as dams, particularly the Kashmir Dam, acted as India's Brahmastra against Pakistan. Brahmastra, by the way, it's a sacred Hindu weapon, for those of you who don't know. It represented in the popular discourse a civilizational structure that could help realize the dream of an Akhand Bharat, or an undivided India. Renewable hydropower, therefore, acted as a force to renew a Hindu nation and harness its organic Hindu power in the service of this undivided Akhand India, a Bharat, a forever and eternal entity. While Kashmir was forcibly annexed and Kashmiri lives and resources rendered even more precarious, hydropower's newfound renewability offered a promise to reclaim Kashmir's mythic Hindu past and secure India's forever energy futures. The political and material logics that co-produce hydropower as India's forever asset and Kashmir as India's eternal and timeless Hindu territory thus intersected to naturalize the expanse of Indian territoriality. As claims of hydropower's foreverness melded with India's primordial links to Kashmir, the project of re-engineering nation and nature worked in concert to produce India's contested sovereignty in Kashmir. Thank you.
I think I'm going to have some comments for you, but
I'm going to have to write them. So let me grab a pen.
I can share it with them with you. Thank you, Mona, for that fascinating talk. And as I was reading it and then rereading it and listening to you, I was just impressed at how beautifully you have pulled together so many strands and packed this into a compelling and a very desperate narrative of how the Indian state is operating. And as someone who is interested in the politics of nature and how it is recruited in projects of power, of state and state capital and community, I just have a lot of questions, and you answered many, but I really can't wait to read your book. I was impressed the way in which you talk about, connect the various dots and recast the story of hydropower as technologies of border infrastructures. The paper weaves a complex and even dense tapestry of India's occupation of Kashmir is systematically naturalizing and normalizing, especially in this moment as India is increasingly becoming a Hindu majoritarian state, the politics of hydropower and of environment in general. As I was reading the paper, I kept on thinking that this is occupation by other means. The protagonist, as Mona has told us in her story, is the Kashmir Dam that is built at the border of India and Pakistan and Kashmir. Dams, as we know, are two-faced monsters, replete with promise and peril. Mona urges us to revisit the ways in which we typically view dams and interrogate the political and ideological work dams do. Like other systems or waterworks that reinscribe and reorganize the social spatial contours transforming deserts into agricultural land, like the place where I do my research. Dams are not just sites or innocent instruments of pure hydropower, nor are they temples of modernity and development, as India's first Prime Minister famously described them. But dams, as Mona argues, in this political, economic, and ecological conjunctures, emerge simultaneously as embodiments of modernity, sovereignty, Hindu nationhood, tools for civilizing minority populations, and importantly, as weapons of combat, control, and counterinsurgency. And it is this capaciousness of dams of as nature's infrastructures that they have increasingly come to serve as a tool for controlling people and their territories, dispossessed and disciplined residents. An attempt to secure consent for work of the deep state they perform. They're indeed, as Mona points out, a security military apparatus. There is, of course, a very vast and rich discussion in political ecology and environmental history that engage with the politics and genealogy of dam and dam building. For instance, I was recently reading about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD on the Nile, which is finally nearing completion being built for almost 40 years. It was the dam that launched the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front at the turn of the millennium and pursued by the current Prosperity Party, so that there's a kind of recurrence of this theme, that amidst extensive and was aimed to introduce extensive economic reforms with the aim of building a developmental state and to transform the Ethiopian economy and society. But going back even further, I was specifically reminded of Donald Worster's famous book, which I started my better school with, called Rivers of Empire, Water, Aridity, and the Growth of the American West, published in 1987. Worster, an American environmental historian, explores the history of rivers and dams in American West, especially in California, and in particular describes how a technological empire based on vast water projects designed by engineers and controlled by a small managerial elite led to what he calls as hydraulic civilization. As a committed Marxist, he was actually writing against Karl Wittvogel's turn of face post-war, and who was making claims about Oriental despotism elsewhere. What Worster turned around to shine light was about the despotic state which was in action in the American West at that time. This is I'm talking about in the 40s and 50s. Worster argued that the river bureaucracy and private interests in water, and particularly water and land, resulted in increased centralization of power and led to the rise of a priest-like managerial class and a capitalist state, which was not unlike fascist totalitarianism that Wittfogel was describing. And this he was talking about an arid landscape. This, one could argue, was rather prescient. If we are to recall the unfortunate map of the Electoral College last week, with plenty of red in the American West, although not in California, was about this, fascist totalitarian state which has emerged in the context of the political ecology of water and land and its circulations. Bandipur and Gurez are far from the American West, of course, but almost a century later, comparable rationales of developmentalism, of peace and prosperity circulate the discourse of dams and clean energy. While these border towns embody the spatiality of the border, of vulnerability and possibly precarity, there is of course a temporality to this also, which makes it important to perhaps think of dams as, in David Harvey's sense, spatio-temporal fixes and track how dams do the work of preparing the terrain for state and capital to extend their reaches. 2019, as you point out, is a pivotal year for Kashmir in many ways. Of course, the narrative of hydropower emerges as the green becomes good, and then Modi comes to power with a landslide success in 2019, his second term, and Kashmir was not coincidental. It was a planned exercise of taking away Kashmir's special constitutional status as an autonomous territory also in 2019. So this 2019 is a critical moment for us to think about and how these conjunctures articulate and what happens. In this specific conjuncture, the imperial and territorial designs of the Indian state come to be realized through dams and nature at large. Nature and its affordances are weaponized, once again, through various means, by extended power outages or by using the foil of disciplining those who are deemed to be committing power theft. And I think power is a kind of, double play again, power theft in many ways. And thinking of this competitive narrative and examples you present, I have lots of things which are coming to my head, but I'm going to restrict them to some big questions, small questions, whichever way you want to see them. And here I'm thinking more as somebody with Donald Worster, thinking from a more Marxist political ecology perspective, to thinking about, Worster's claim is how do we think about ecology and its materiality in more constitutive ways or in constitutive ways? And how do we evaluate how nature is implicated in the technologies of statecraft? And I was wondering if you could say something about how the ecologies of place matter, right? I mean, how exactly is this mountainous, riverine landscape? What does Bandipora and Gurez share? Why not other sites? What are do different ecologies of coast, mountains, deserts, agricultural fields contour the practices and discourses of state power similarly or discourses? So what, in some sense, I'm asking an anthropological questions, what is it about this place which engenders a particular kind of statecraft? Kashmir is politically fraught, but how does its mountainous ecology intersect with or not the efforts of the state-making and territorializing? In other words, what is it about Bandipora that it is not only the site of the dam but also of counterinsurgency and now compliance? What are the histories of power and domination in this region, patterns of land ownership, livelihoods, movement, migration that has produced such a tense and fraught terrain? So something about thinking both ecologically and historically about this place. The second question, as you can imagine, is about renewability. It is a new kid in the block, we know. But the question is, does this kid play the same games in every block? With developmentalism in the 60s and 70s, then sustainability in the 80s and 90s preceding it, renewability and contemporary environmental discourse signals a logic and architecture of what perhaps Jim Ferguson had described almost in 1990 as the anti-politics machine. So why is renewability so powerful? How does it work to depoliticize the context? And if in the ways in which I'm thinking about renewability, if greening, clean energy designs, or what you talk about, the illiberal forms of state making play out in Kashmir in particular ways, I can imagine that greenwashing in India's Adivasi heartland, or in my field site in Gurgaon, urban peripheries, or in Delhi, or in coastal Goa, or elsewhere is one thing, which predominantly Hindu population. But what does greenwashing mean in a Muslim-dominated area, in a highly fraught, contested domain? What are the other registers or promises and aspirations that are rolled into the logic of developmentalism and renewability? In other words, what does renewability work with or work against that enrolls citizens? And here I'm particularly thinking with Doreen Massey's work on double articulation. As spaces are recomposed, subjects are also being recomposed, and this is the ways in which what else is happening on the ground, that renewability or greenwashing or environmentalism becomes so appealing. Are there any specific codes, signs, messages, instruments, and figures that discursively mobilize renewability in different political and ecological contexts? And what are the long and short-term implications of rehabilitating former Kashmiri counterinsurgents or surrendered militants in Kishan Ganga Dam and cementing pro-India networks? How is it going to work out? Are we going to see down the road a different kind of configuration? And finally, and this is a question which I've been grappling with ever since I did my fieldwork and my doctoral fieldwork, about the question of primordialism, right? The way in which my own work was on the Chipko movement and how there is, the categories of nature, nation, native, they come to articulate in interesting and strange ways. Hinduizing nature, as I had argued earlier, and celebrating Shiva's hair locks, or summoning women's, Vandana Shiva called women's female Shakti, as some kind of instinctive traditional environmentalism has been part of the new traditionalist playbook for a while. even before BJP came into power. I mean, I'm talking about the 80s and 90s. It has, of course, been emboldened in recent decades, and it is quite efficacious, as we know, as we're seeing it in the case of the place I'm more familiar, Uttarakhand, that has become the laboratory of Hinduत्व forces as a Devbhumi. My question is, I'm kind of partly, struggling with it myself, and I may pose it as an open question to you. How in this late capitalist neoliberal moment, facing serious existential crisis, what is so appealing about ecofascism or environmentalism? What is it about dams that fuel national imaginaries in contemporary India, and especially in Kashmir, which is not a Hindu-dominated area? How then, as you ask, have dammed hydropower become key to salvaging the Hindu nation? And I'm thinking here, along with dams, what else are the tools of power? After all, dams are also big business. They're huge money-making business. And who are the other actors, perhaps? We're seeing the role of the state, but what about the role of the capital in ensuring that dams get built and new kinds of nationalist citizens and subjects are produced? So I'll leave it here. You don't have to, we can talk about a bit more. I know there's some others who work on power, dams, etc., and energy, so I will open the floor. Muna, do you want to come here perhaps and take questions yourself?
Thank you so much, Shubhra. These were so wonderful. I hope you can share those with me.
If you want to, sure. If you are in the newsletter, happy to.
I would love to. No, thank you.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
These are so generative.
So we have some time for questions, queries, anything you have for Mona or...
Yeah, very simple questions. I mean, Shubhra has a vast knowledge about just the field, but also her questions are so layered. So, from what I know a little bit about Kashmir is that Kashmiri Muslims have a very strong tradition of forest culture, so to speak, and the Sufism that emerged over there is largely from a forest ecology. And now you have the BJP organizing a lot of new festivals, but mostly around water. So I was just wondering how these different ecologies and also the kind of how they've shaped local people's religions and cultural aspects. Are they clashing with each other? Are they melding with each other? Like how does it transpire in a space like Kashmir? And the other question I have is, you actually touched on it towards the end about the question of Akhand Bharat. Now, Akhand Bharat is this idea for those who don't know, by the RSS that parts of Pakistan, even Afghanistan, and some stretch into Bhutan even, are actually parts of India. And there has to be this greater unification of India someday. And of course, when I say India, it also means Hindu India. So, in terms of this larger vision of Akhand Bharat, does withholding water supplies from Pakistan, is that some kind of a strategy for Akhand Bharat eventually? Those are my two obnoxious silly questions.
No, those are great. Thank you. The first one in terms of forest ecologies, and I wouldn't say. Kashmir Muslims are a very heterogeneous community, and it's not just Kashmir Muslims. It's so many other communities who are more, I'd say, dependent on the forest rather than just Kashmiris. There's Gujars, there's Bakarwals, there's Gurezis themselves, nomadic, semi-nomadic communities who really rely on the forest. Gurez and Bandipora are places where you see a deep reliance on the forest. In fact, when people were fighting over compensation benefits, one of the key things was that nobody was compensating them for the forest because that was not seen as quote-unquote private property. And the forest is seen as a nurturer, right? But not all Kashmiri Muslims have that relationship necessarily with the forest. The question of Sufism is a very tricky one in the context of Kashmir, especially in the context of Bandipora, because a lot of counterinsurgents were actually Sufis. So this is a very tricky topic. In fact, that's the part I haven't talked about today. I know there's others here from Kashmir who might be able to speak to this too. But a part of what I'm working on also in this chapter is talking about how India managed to fund certain Muslim religious outfits, radical Muslim religious outfits, as a bulwark against Kashmiri Tehreek, the movement. So on the face of it, it looks like radical Islam, but it's really not. It's radical Islam only to the extent that it ends up depoliticizing Islam. It makes Islam only about looking inward and being a pious Muslim, but there are religious outfits, particularly in Bandipura, driven by the Deobandi ideology, who actually got active support, financial support from the Indian state. In fact, that was the only organization that was getting active financial support from the Indian state. So it's really complicated, the religious landscape. So for people in Bandipura, the Deobandis played a very instrumental part in placating depopulation and using Islam as a way to diffuse the movement for self-determination. And that's why they didn't like Jamaat-e-Islami, because Jamaat-e-Islami proffered a vision of Islam that was fundamentally political. It was not simply about piety, it was also about politics. So that question is really complicated, but a really good one. I hope I've sort of opened it up a little bit, and that's why I'm still struggling with because the fieldwork for that was extremely difficult to do. And that's something I haven't, of course, talked about. Bandipura was a very hard place to work in for multiple reasons, because there's so many different agents and agencies and actors, and a lot of them in collusion with each other, sometimes not. So it's kind of it's a very fraught space in that regard, because it's seen years of Ikhwan monopoly, especially under Usman Majid, who's now the rehabilitated politician, which kind of goes back to your question too. I mean, he's still very functional despite multiple court cases against him, and is still holding India's flag high. So very much in power still to this day. The second question, I don't know. I mean, the other thing I want to actually do, I do want to say this, that the Hindu right, or the narrative of the Hindu right is not a single narrative. I mean, there's contradictions built into that narrative, and I do not want to present the Hindu right as one monolithic ideology either. So if you see, on the one hand, there's Hindu right folks who will say, well, we should in fact give up on the word Indus altogether. They're very invested, that's why they are, that particular group of people are very invested in reviving the Saraswati River, the mythic Saraswati River, because for them that's older than the Indus. So they want to revive it because they really like, this is a done deal, it's with Pakistan, who cares. In any case, this does not represent us, it's Saraswati that represents us. So there's that section of the people too, and then there's the other section, kind of going back to your question too, about what energizes this. Why hydropower, or why dams to salvage Indian or Hindu nationhood? Because for a lot of them, dams are also very masculine structures, and that's an older discourse about what dams represent. In fact, I do talk about that in one of the chapters, where the very presence of so many engineers, all male, Indian engineers in that landscape doing manly things, doing engineering things that were seen as expressions of ultimate manhood, especially in that space that they want to feminize and tame, is really important as a project. In fact, the term that comes up repeatedly for the work that engineers do is soldiering. Right? So it's often, they call it soldiering work. And they call it soldiering also because they know that NHPC engineers and HCC engineers have access to certain sites and certain pockets, and they're very well aware of the territory, so they know the lay of the land, and they are the best suited for counterinsurgency work. So it is interesting, the slippage between soldiering and engineering is often, and these are NHPC honchos, like the big honchos will say this in their speeches and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean that, I guess. Sorry, there's other questions?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
A couple of them. Noor and then remember.
Yeah, it was a wonderful talk. You said like a lot about dams as sites of violence, exploitation, occupation, or statecraft or nationalism. And I wonder if you can say something about, because these development projects, the dam or others, they also become the site of resistance. Yeah? So they were like little, they were, I know that's not the focus of your topic, but yeah, but there were like some reflections also. They can say something about how the dams or other projects become sites of resistance in Kashmir, or and also like, can you say something like this narrative of which we see most in indigenous societies, like resisting along or with the rivers, with the mountains, with the land, you know, like river itself resisting to be tamed.
That's a great question. Thank you. I do talk about it, and I mean I've also written about it in parts. For the book, I'm struggling with it a little. I have to confess, because I think I'm in a different state of mind too. It's a state of despair generally that Kashmiris are feeling right now. So it's a hard question to tackle for me right now, given the moment. But I'm really glad you asked. So in large part, I think Kashmiri environmental consciousness, it's kind of taken a while to come to what it is now. I think it started with the floods of 2014. There was this massive flood in 2014. I feel until then, people were not actually having this conversation in the streets about what the connections are, what the connection might be between political and economic sovereignty, environmental sovereignty. Those are questions that activists were talking about, but we still, I remember having this conversation in 2012, 2013 with some key activists who told me, right, that for some reason they've not been able to forge that conversation more broadly. But 2014 changed that to a large extent, because floods were suddenly seen as political. It was seen as a political event. It was not simply seen as an ecological disaster. It was seen as a political event. And I have written about that, how it was seen as a political event and why, and how people were seeing different ways to think about nature as having its own agency, having its own force that it was exerting on the Indian state. So there were some of those conversations happening. Insofar as the dam is concerned, at least the Kishinganga Dam, there's a lot of resistance against the NHPC for compensation. There's a lot of resistance for not getting the right kind of employment. And it's very easy. That's why I thought our conversation this morning was so useful, because it's very easy for people to fold that into a Marxist narrative alone, right? And say it's a class struggle, it's labor that is not getting its due, and they are up against the NHPC and the military. I use the framework of accumulation by occupation rather than accumulation by dispossession to kind of bring these two realities together, because I don't think we can understand these labor struggles in the Kashmir context without locating them also in the larger context of militarized occupation, because labor struggles are completely shut down by the state. I mean, there's PSAs, for example, that are against union activists. They impose PSAs, which are very draconian laws that can put people behind bars without sentence. These are preventive detentions, right, that the government uses to punish union workers. So one of my chapters actually deals with unions and the kind of brutal apparatus that was mobilized against them. But when I spoke about dams and resistance, people couldn't resist it. I mean, in Gurez, people would say, we are surrounded by 4 mountains, where would we go? it's a national security project. We can't voice any opinions against it because it's a national security project. And you cannot say a word against it because you'll be in jail for n number of years. So there was a clamping down of that sort of resistance from day one because it was framed as a national security project. That there was no alternative but this. So I don't know if that. I know what you're talking about. The river itself being this agent of force. I mean, the only way I can answer that right now is during the floods. Women in particular, especially in Uri, which was deeply impacted by the floods, conversed with, in their minds, they conversed with jinn because they saw that the jinn came to life at a very particular point in that moment, in that political moment and that ecological moment. And they felt that the jinn could suddenly traverse landscapes and waterscapes that had not been hitherto possible because India had kept up, made these barricades and checkpoints and so on and so forth. And because the floods destroyed them to an extent, it allowed the jinn to travel freely. I've actually written about that in a paper. I can send that to you. It was a fascinating story for me because it really opened my eyes to a whole different world, the jinnat, the world of the jinn, which even for people here in Gurez and in Bandipura, they would say, the jinn don't live here anymore. We've lost the jinn because they don't have a place to live. The dam has destroyed their lives too. But they also recognize that they have power, and oftentimes I would also hear things like, it's good that India is flooding the river because they call it a flood often. They call it sehlab. They didn't call it dam. They call it a sehlab, which means a flood. So they will often tell me, it's good that India is flooding the river because eventually, we will reunite with Pakistan. Or, there was that sort of an imaginary too that the river will allow the unification that India is not letting happen. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that somewhat answers your question, but that is a good one, and I'm struggling with it. Sananda, you have a question? Go ahead.
My question is similar but slightly different. You might have partially answered it. So it's about infrastructural politics and how infrastructures become sites of negotiation, terrains of negotiation between the state, capital, and citizens. I work on oil and infrastructure in India, and what I see constantly is how, while the state uses these oil and infrastructure as tools of regulation and tools of discipline, there is a constant evasion of that and distortion through interloping of all kinds. And I'm wondering how that plays out in your context, because Kashmir is colonized, and so I suppose there would be less spaces for negotiation, and like you've said. But at the same time, like you talked about these power theft things. However, like in a dam, as opposed to, which is a structural edifice, as opposed to a distributive infrastructure like the kind that I study, there would be less spaces for that, and so the materiality of that would also probably make a difference. So I'm just curious about how interloping, whether at all it exists, and if yes, then how it works.
That's a great question. Also, sort of interfaces, I think, with Shubhra's. What is about the place? What is it about the place? I'm actually thinking through that question. I mean, Timothy Mitchell's work on carbon and the kind of mobilizations of labor, for example, that carbon allows. Or the kind of placemaking that carbon doesn't necessarily need, but hydropower does, because you need hydropower in a place. You need to build these structures in a place, and they stay there. So it is a different kind of placemaking and a different way to think about space, and also how space is often used then to justify, or the kind of landscape, or the kind of space that Gurez and Bandipura is often used to justify why those dams are being built there. It gives a very sort of naturalized rationale, which often means saying, well, we need a high head for the water to fall on the powerhouse, so we do need mountains. We need a particular kind of a landscape from where we can get the head, the fall, which is what they mean, the height and the fall. So because that's what generates power. So I'm kind of working with that idea. I'm right in the middle of that now, thinking about how to think about what hydropower needs and how hydropower, the materiality of hydropower and the kind of material infrastructures that it then produces is often justified using the idea of place itself or space as a natural sort of medium. That's part of your question. The other one was the interloping part. And when you say interloping, is it how people evade these structures?
And probably also like capture, if at all that's possible with the structural edifice, because in the kinds of infrastructures that I study, which are infrastructures of distribution, it's easier to capture.
Yeah.
But I've been thinking about, how in structural edifices it might not be possible.
I think through labor. I mean,
So sabotage.
I mean, there's a lot of that. So, for example, one of the things that I do look at is how the Kashmiri worker is constructed as this indolent, lazy worker, right? And the idea is often that Kashmiris just are not good workers. So that's one way. I mean, and it's true to a large extent. I didn't talk about that for the Kishinganga Dam, you have a roster of people, employees, out of which half of them are just paid. They actually don't go to work. That's how it is, because that's how they are tamed, right? So the idea is you're taming the people, but then you're also using that same discourse to frame them as lazy. So oftentimes, when I to speak with these NHPC engineers, a young engineer who must have been maybe in his early 30s, was kind of really just feeling it as he was explaining to me. He goes, I don't understand why Kashmiris don't want to learn. There's an entire industry here, right at your doorstep, and you're just so resistant to learning. Look at me. I come from this very small village in somewhere, and I'm here now. If they learn too, and if they actually chose to work, then they would find jobs, right, that are meaningful. So I think it's through labor and its curtailment or its abstention that happens. I mean, I've heard stories also about like these tunnels, right? The tunnel is a big infrastructure, especially in Kishinganga, because it is a 23.5 kilometer long tunnel that was built for transferring water. And a lot of times what happens inside the tunnels is, one of the big narratives or rumors early on, 2012, 2013, was, they're building this half of the tunnel in Gurez, the other half is being built in Bandipura. The one in Bandipura was being built using manual labor. And this one from here was being built using a tunnel boring machine, which also required labor, but of a different kind. So their argument was, these two will never meet. And that's what we're hoping will happen, that these two ends never meet. So there's those forms of kind of imaginaries of resistance too. They're not always what's actually happening, but I do take them seriously for what they can sort of reveal about the nature of that labor that people are being forced into. And then there's more to that. Just trying to remember if I can think of any off the bat. But yeah, it will come to me. But yes, I think labor is certainly one of them. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Follow-ups? Zach?
Maybe something more about the labor, and I think the way that you connected it to counterinsurgency was very interesting. And I look at hydropower in Canada, but broadly sort of this green extractivism. And with infrastructures and extractive projects, the jobs are intense and short term, but then they go away. The infrastructure or the hole in the ground or whatever remains. The people remain, but the jobs are gone. So I'm really interested in this sort of interaction, like temporal interaction, the time scales in terms of like the infrastructure as counterinsurgency, and the counterinsurgency being this multi-decade project, but the specific, in specific places there can only be jobs for specific periods. So I was wondering if you had any more sort of...
That's a great question, thank you. That's great. So yes, absolutely. I mean, that was at the heart, right, of this struggle at least in Gurez. Also in Bandipura to an extent, not as much because there were 5 fully affected families in Bandipura, and obviously the way the corporation makes that claim is also deeply problematic, right? Who's fully affected, who's partially affected. I mean, those are based on some random criteria of, again, time scale. The time scale is so short for determining what those long and short term impacts could be. But yeah, so the big issue in Gurez particularly was that people were given jobs to the HCC, which is a subcontracting company. And they had been promised jobs to the NHPC, which is, if you get a job with the NHPC, it's a government job, right? It's for life. So they were promised jobs to the NHPC, but they ended up getting jobs to the HCC. So that was like the big thing, right? One of the big reasons people were mobilizing against the dam was because they recognized the short-term contractual nature of HCC jobs. What's interesting also is, and that's what I do in that chapter on unionization, because there were a lot of these union representatives who were handpicked by the HCC to keep the population under control. So I thankfully had the opportunity to interview them in 2013 and then again in 2018. So 2013 was when they were again harping on this narrative of Kashmiris being lazy themselves. I mean, there was a Kashmiri himself who was saying this to me, that Kashmiris are lazy, they don't want to work. I keep telling them, look at me, I've made so much progress, I go to Bombay all the time because HCC headquarters is in Bombay. I go to Bombay all the time, I've done this, I've done that. And then fast forward 2018, the same guy telling me they ruined us, right? So I feel, and what people kept telling me was, we didn't know what we were getting into. There were these tall promises. We should have done it then. We should have resisted the dam then. Now it's too late, right? We can't do anything about it. So that was the other sort of in response to your question too. That now we've kind of the ship has sailed, and now it's too late, and we ruined, because look at the long term. Because the temporality of it is also the ecological effect. The ecological effects continue, and they're now seeing it more and more, right? With the water, for example, the NHPC has built a permanent station in Bandipura. It's actually one of the biggest in the country. So they've already occupied vast amounts of land that they've now taken over for good, and that has implications for everything else around. So it's for them. They will say that we didn't know enough, and we wish our leaders had told us or cautioned us in time, but they didn't, because they sold their land. They were some of the first people who sold their land, and then we were left with no choice. So there's that kind of, and insofar as what's happening now, I mean, now things are really different post 2019. The discourse has shifted so much that, that's a whole different paper, I think. Yeah, but thank you for that question.
I think we're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Okay, we have some small snacks. Please help yourselves.
Thank you so much for those great comments.
Of course I will. Yeah, we have to take a picture by the way. Here, where? I think others can also join.